Hello and welcome to our video series where we're getting into conversation with leaders in IT and Agile about subjects that they're passionate about. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David Harding. David is a business management consultant with extensive experience in complex multinational and often high risk and very highly regulated organizations. And that's included a number of FTSE 100 organisations and the UK government. And I think that's actually where we met at a stage while you were working with the UK government.
It was. Yeah.
And you've led a number of transformation and other flagship initiatives. The reason for today's call, or we're getting together, David's current research is focusing on the impact of digital technologies, or the impact of digital technologies, sorry, on IT leaders. And that brings us to today's topic, which is the current and future position of CIOs. So welcome, David. Thank you very much for joining me on this video today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll see where this conversation takes us. So let me just ask you a general question to start with. In your current research, as we said, you're looking into the subject of CIOs. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you've been able to identify?
Well, thank you, Stephen. Yes, I've been looking at the role of the CIO for the last 4.5 years, with a heavy emphasis on the research side of the role. My initial interest started having worked alongside and worked for a number of CIOs who shall remain nameless at this point.
Yep.
Many of those individuals were inspiring in the sense that they seemed to know everything.
Okay.
About everything. They seem to be very much up to speed with latest trends in technology, and in fact, almost all the large change programs or transformational programs I've been involved with, the CIO tended to be the go-to person. So that's spot the interest in the research. The question in my mind at the time was what is a CIO? What makes a CIO? Or perhaps how would one become a CIO? Where the research has focused is largely looking at a comparison between academic insights from many years of research. So the role was actually, or the term CIO was actually instigated way back in the early 1980s by a chap called Sinnott. So I've been comparing academic thinking and research on the role with a combination of my own personal experiences and some quite recent research into CIO recruitment.
Okay. Do those kind of worlds align? So between the academic view and the commercial view, or your own experience?
It's a great question, Stephen. I think when I started on the research, I really wasn't sure what I was going to discover. What I did find quite quickly is that the academia is very, very all-encompassing. It focuses on many aspects of the CIO's role. And some of the conclusions which are being born out of the research is largely centered on the fact that the role is sort of highly contingent. I can come back to that point later on. But when I reflect on my own personal experiences of CIOs or Chief Information Officers, what tends to be taken for granted is that largely one size fits all. So in other words, anybody who's been a CIO in organization X can equally fall into becoming a CIO role at organization B. There doesn't seem to be a huge distinction between organization types or industry types and specific roles. So that's been quite interesting. And then the more recent research I've done looking at CIO recruitment has, for me, been the real eye-opener. It's drawn out two very different perspectives on the role, quite stark perspectives between how UK organisations or recruiters of CIOs in the UK are advertising what they require from CIOs and what academia and personal experience has shown me over the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay. I'm intrigued about the discrepancy between those two. So there's
Sure.
Is there some kind of clear focus of what academia is looking at and what
Yeah,
the role is looking at. There's a number of points here to come back to, but
yeah,
perhaps start with that.
sure. I think that the biggest surprise for myself really um, is having perhaps spent some time fairly heavily immersed in academic research. The main conclusion over this almost 40-year history of research is that the role is not necessarily somebody who's highly technical. They sit at board level. They're strategic thinkers. They are outwardly looking from the organization as well as inwardly looking. And they report into the CEO. And they're one of the few C-suite members who have this fairly broad jurisdictional area. In other words, they cover all functional areas in any given organization. Not surprising given the importance of IT to organizations. So that was the academic view, and largely it was the impression I'd formed from my own experiences. What I found is, so just a little bit more information about the research itself. I spent just over 12 months gathering job adverts for CIOs. And once I'd collected, it was in the region of about 250 job adverts, and I should stress that 250 was selected from an initial sample size of circa about 4,500 job adverts. So you can see that a lot of adverts were being advertised as CIOs, and it's quite clear that those roles weren't CIOs.
Okay.
And again, I can come back to that point. Out of the sample, or out of the job adverts I actually shortlisted and selected for the study, even those were deemed to be fairly atypical chief information officers. Closer study revealed that for the UK, or for this particular sample of UK advertised roles, and just to stress, these roles are for UK positions as well.
Okay.
It's very clear that the job adverts are looking for people who are highly technical, people who don't necessarily sit at board level or potentially report into the board level. That they're very much focused with a very sort of heavy inward focus to their organization. So an awful lot of requirement for people who understand internal customers through service management. A lot of phrases talking around leadership, but leadership in the context of leading managers to deal with incremental change around the service desk. So the broad brush difference, to answer your question, the broad brush difference between academia, my own experiences, and these job adverts is that the disparity is that academics, and again from my own experience, see CIOs or perceive CIOs as being strategic thinkers. I mean, I would go as far as arguing that CIOs form the natural successor to CEOs. So that gives you a bit more context for how important the role has become. But unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, the clear requirement here in the UK for a CIO is actually for somebody who I would suggest is actually an IT director as opposed to a board level chief information officer.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the colour there.
Okay.
Just to understand that a little bit more, because it sounds like the academic view is very much a strategic, and as you describe, a board level leader who is through their influence, their technical influence, is directly influential in the direction of the organization. And then you've got the recruitment view, which is much more practical. I wouldn't be surprised to see a few has experience of agile and other phrases like that would land on that. Just why not complete the bingo card, right?
Yes,
and you've got the whole thing. From your, where do kind of you sit on this? Do you, from the work you've done with CIOs, is there genuinely a description of a CIO that sits between those 2 points, or is it as black and white as this, that you're that or you're an IT director?
It's a really good question, Stephen. I think, I mean, there's an argument that says that I'll come back to this word I used before, contingency, which I suppose is really a way of saying it depends. Obviously, a lot of CIOs are going to make the case that their individual circumstance, or the circumstance of their individual organization is fairly unique, and therefore they need a fairly unique type of person to be their chief information officer. However, having said that, I would stress there's still a core set of what I would call attributes, which all board level CIOs should have.
Okay.
And the standardization, if that's a good word to use, the standardization of those sort of core skills and attributes, I think should be applicable or equally applicable, irrespective of the type of role which is sought by the organization. So I haven't answered your question directly. I think the answer is it does depend. But I think even though there is a dependency on circumstance and environment, there's still this sort of central core set of attributes that any CIO should actually aspire to.
Okay, and that certainly relates to the point I think you made earlier when you were talking about your earlier research, rather, and seeing as perhaps an extremely effective CIO, let's imagine, leaves organization X.
Sure.
Then when they're out there looking for work and they're being presented with all manner of things,
sure,
it'd be intriguing to see how that CIO, well, it's per your answer, the CIO would define themselves based on the influence and the results and the ability that they've had in their session,
absolutely.
presumably.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, just going, so swinging back to the sort of academic literature, there's a view or a process which is widely accepted called Rolemaking, and it's exactly that point you described. It's where, and this tends to apply to more sort of senior positions, but there's a recognition that once you've onboarded a C-suite or a sort of senior executive, that there's a 6 to 12 month period of sort of bedding in. And what bedding in really entails is the organization really trying to work out how it can best make use of this CIO, and equally for the individual who's been employed, how they work out how to position themselves within that sort of unique environment. So there's a bit of a toing and froing between the two sort of loci, if you like, while they what was a coming together of minds about what the role is actually there to achieve.
Okay, but that's, as you said, that's something that happens during the life of the person.
Over time. I think it'd be very difficult to try and address that sort of misalignment during. So for example, if we're talking about the scenario where we're recruiting a new chief information officer, I would suggest it's quite difficult to play out that alignment process between the prospect or the applicant, CIO, and the organization. Just going back to the job adverts, the thing I noticed a lot, or what the results suggested to me, was that the whoever was behind the advert, whether it was the CEO, the HR department, or how big a role the recruitment agent had in putting together the job advert, it was quite clear it wasn't really obvious what the purpose of the role would be. So whoever gets recruited, from the job advert itself, it wasn't clear what the purpose of the job would be. And when I say purpose, we can swing from different extremes, but it encompasses things like, somebody who can do cost reduction, somebody who can win hearts and minds and deliver a cultural change, somebody who can expand our customer base. So you hear all these sorts of phrases in the job adverts. So that gives you a bit of a hint to role purpose. But again, it still doesn't give over or present the message of what the expectation is of the role. And this is where, once the CIO has been recruited into the position, there's probably some shaping by the CIO of some of these strategic intentions of the organization going forward. But if you're a service manager or an IT director, it's very, very hard to get visibility or even credibility at a board level if you're held at that position.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Because when you described those three roles, winning hearts and minds, cost reduction, and delivering cultural change, I think were the three that you used. As you said that, I'm imagining three different people.
Sure.
I'm imagining, or rather, you don't find necessarily a person that can excel at all three of those in one person very often. I'm sure perhaps those people do exist, but
yeah.
Or so perhaps in there's a really interesting point, isn't it? It's if a hiring organization misses this question,
yeah,
I guess they stand to lose out or stand to hire
oh,
someone who
absolutely.
is.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. I mean, the thing the sort of one of the many conclusions I come to is, although job adverts, in this sort of context of recruitment, although the job adverts do attempt to list out attributes, the attribute descriptions tend to be very, very, not surprisingly, very woolly. So words like strong, words like must be a heavy hitter. Yeah, exactly. Words like must be able to must be able to program in Python. One of the adverts for a CIO paying a six-figure salary wanted somebody who could program in Python. So again, well, unfortunately, that one didn't make my shortlist. But you see all these attempts to list specific attributes. So that's kind of one aspect of this. The other aspect is what I call social capital from again, academic perspective. And what social capital does, it explains, it's another way of talking about the profile of the person you're looking for. And that tends to translate into things like their educational background, their age, number of years of experience, their sort of evidence of being able to communicate and influence effectively. So some of the applications, some of the skills at board level. Some of those descriptions do start to creep in to the job adverts. But what was most surprising, amongst many surprises I had, what was most surprising was that the evidence of years experience, so time served, for example, seemed to be taken as a proxy for an individual's capabilities. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, if you've had 10 years experience, if you've been exposed to a board before, what that means is you have, so what's implied by this is that you have the capabilities to influence and lead, that you have X knowledge, Y skills, you can exhibit certain behaviors and so on and so forth. So the implication is that rank, status, years experience is much more important than actual evidence of capabilities. Now, you could argue that you wouldn't expect to see this level of thinking or detail in a job advert, but the point I would press for anybody who's looking to recruit a CIO, you need to look past this concept of seniority and rank and previous positions. If you're going to avoid the point you're suggesting, Stephen, if you're going to avoid this situation where you interview somebody who on the surface has the right profile or has a desirable profile, let's say, but isn't necessarily able to exhibit the application of the attributes which would have delivered their credibility in a sort of previous post.
Thank you. I'm really glad you said that, and certainly my own experience. When you hire anybody, I know from a year's service point of view, there's been various legislation or otherwise around age discrimination anyhow in this space. But certainly years of service don't guarantee quality or a depth of capability in anyone. In any case, it depends entirely on perhaps exactly what you've done, and as you say, on measuring or being able to see. It's not even just measuring and being able to see potential. It also is beholden on an organization to create the space to release that potential. That's the CIO you talked about earlier that was, the fictitious one that was incredibly successful in company A wasn't successful because just the CIO. They presumably had teams, they had support, they had engagement from their peers, engagement from the boards, they had a budget to work with, or whatever the things might be.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Go on.
Sorry.
Sorry, you wanted to say something? No,
Right, well,
please.
I was going to say, I think a trap a lot of companies fall into, and I don't think this just applies to the CIO. I think it probably applies to many C-suite level individuals.
Mm,
I think the mistake is there's some pre-agreed assumption that you can link an individual's I'll use the word attributes. So what I actually mean by attributes is things like knowledge, skills, behaviors,
yeah.
social capital, and so on and so forth. That there's a direct link between those attributes and some organizational level of firm performance. So that's, again, it's a long-winded way of saying if somebody is skilled in so-called digital, then within 6 months of recruitment, we're bound to have doubled our customer base, because digital means marketing, doesn't it? Digital means you're great at marketing, and therefore we're going to have growth. If you have
Yeah.
more customers, you're bound to have growth. Oh, and the growth will be profitable, surely. So you get into these ridiculous, in my opinion, you get into these ridiculous conversations where you're assessing an individual at this firm, let's call it a firm level, sort of perspective of firm performance. When in fact, if you step back and just go back to what you were saying, Stephen, if you step back and look at any one individual, any one firm level performance metric, you can work out very, very quickly. There's probably 1,000, if not tens of thousands, of potential impacts on that particular measure. So you can't really attribute an individual to a firm level performance. And I think this is a trap many organizations fall into. And as I was hinting at before, this gets more complicated, particularly if you don't really know what you're looking for in your CIO to start with. So all of a sudden you have an individual who you haven't really perhaps selected, or you haven't agreed with them what's expected with the rest of the C-suite, for example, and then you're assessing them at some arbitrary firm level measure of performance. So in my opinion, it's a recipe for short-term, high turnover, short tenures, basically, which is what the evidence does suggest for the CIO.
And this is not cheap turnover per se for an organization.
It's not.
Because you spend 6 months trying to find a transformative CIO, or whatever the title of the job description says.
Yeah.
And then 18 months later, you're probably, well, I say probably, that's an assertion too far, but it could be that it costs you money to remove that person from your organization as well, because you've made a mistake, and there's. Yeah. So I know you said a little earlier about you would encourage people recruiting CIOs to look beyond some of that social capital and at least begin to focus on what the specific thing is that they need in the organization. What actually is that CIO? I had a couple of related questions, really, which was just in part further advice for organizations, or indeed CIOs themselves, in this process. But I wonder, there's an industry as well, whether there's a gap and a need here to be able to provide some piece of solid ground that when you're hiring a CIO, or as a CIO in waiting, or someone who's trying to grow that way, that you've got a sense of what skills might be relevant for you to develop. At the moment, it feels a bit
woody,
random, to say the least.
It does. I mean, I don't know if this is the best solution, but one thing I think wouldn't do any harm, and I can see it doing an awful lot of good, is to develop some sort of standardized framework. I use the phrase professions. So if you think about people who are chartered engineers or chartered accountants, I know there is such a thing as a chartered IT professional. I think the British Computer Society provide that qualification. But for CIOs in particular, I think because the role, in my opinion, is so unique and enduring, and also by nature of its position has to continuously change and evolve, often in quite short time spans. I think if we can get some sort of framework of professions, some sort of articulation of again, coming back to this idea of sort of core attributes of any given CIO, irrespective of whether it's an SME, a small to medium sized enterprise or some large global behemoth, there's got to be a core set of attributes which are always relevant to any given CIO. And I think if we can work out what those are, and how to articulate those, then at least the individual outside of their place of work can start to do some self-assessment and personal development against a consistent framework. So at least that would give them a better understanding of themselves in terms of their profession.
Yeah.
And it would give them something to articulate their profile as well. So that would do nothing but help organizations who are looking for some sort of consistency through the headhunting process.
Yeah. I was the thing that struck me as you said that, just the last moment, was the there's a piece of education perhaps in organizations here, in CEOs and boards or otherwise, about perhaps a little bit of understanding of what they could have in a CIO. Not just we need a CIO because that's what it said at the back of the Times supplement at the weekend, but because actually these kind of outcomes are the sort of thing that a CIO, given the mandate, can achieve in spades in your organization.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is some sort of a thought process which talks about well, there's some debate about the future of the CIO, and it comes back to an earlier point you made, Stephen, about how can any one individual fulfill so many expectations.
Yeah.
But the thinking is that if digital does equal marketing, which I personally don't think it does, but that does seem to be the trend at the moment, then there is justification for somebody to be outwardly looking from the company. So understanding the marketplace, understanding customer behaviors, understanding the whole sort of digital front end, the whole customer experience development technologies, and so on and so forth. So there is a need for that outwardly looking C-suite person. But my logic or thinking is always, well, that's great. So you generate a huge new demand on your company. The phones start to get hot, as it were, as more and more people start to contact you with requests for your services and products. Well, your back end won't be ready to be able to effectively deal with that surge in demand.
Yeah.
So somebody needs to be looking inwardly to the company, and I don't mean operational directors. I'm talking somebody in the C-suite with a cross-functional perspective needs to understand what's going to happen or what the company is capable of doing or achieving once this expected surge arrives. And I think there is a case for employing more C-suite level individuals in response to digital technology, so chief marketing officers, chief digital officers, and so on and so forth. However, for companies who don't really want to flood their boardroom with more exec members, then I think the CIO is still well positioned to have this inwardly focused, outwardly focused type of perspective for the business. If that was possible, and I believe it is possible, then that individual would be, as I said, in a fairly unique position to help shape the business. So they become a strategic enabler for change. And the way I think about this is, rather than a CIO responding to a market situation, if your organization is sort of digitally mature enough, let's say, then you can put yourself into a position where you're actually starting to explain to the customer what's possible, and you start to educate your customers into what's possible for them from your sort of service offering. And again, I see that messaging as coming via the CIO office.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate the conversation around this, and it definitely sounds like, well, as your research continues and as we go through this space, it really does feel like, I think my main takeaway from the conversation, perhaps more than anything, is the opportunity loss here of an organization perhaps getting it wrong. They may even have hired a phenomenally capable CIO, but their own interpretation or understanding of the box that person sits in, or the space that they're given, or the resources that they're given, probably mean that they might lose out, especially if they're hiring along in context, as you say, very technical, or rather very operational skills, an IT director.
Yeah, It certainly sounds like this. I mean, certainly for the UK. Just going back to the sort of research into the job adverts. I guess if I had to summarise my two main conclusions from the work.
Thank you.
One was that these are quite hard-hitting comments, but it's based purely on this sort of sample of evidence.
Yeah, please.
The first observation is that UK organisations don't really understand the relevance and importance of digital technologies. That seems quite clear. And secondly, in that context, they don't understand the relevance and or role or importance of the CIO in dealing with those opportunities on offer through digitization. Sorry, not digitization, but through digital transformation. So to come back to your point, it does seem like there's a huge opportunity being missed here, and I would perhaps revisit some of my experiences way back in the sort of 1990s, where there was such a focus on, to really show my age here, a lot of focus on the Y2K issue, and then ERP came along to kind of help with that increased level of integration. And even in those sort of heavy days of these sort of global ERP implementations, I was heavily involved with. The conversation bluntly tended to be, okay, we've got an IT system, let's implement it. Let's spend an awful lot of money implementing this system. And what was the problem again? After the fact, and it's almost as blatant as just the fact that we've gone live with some IT means we've achieved something. Well, as we all know, once you throw the big switch on your big new shiny IT system, that's when you, from that point forward, that's when you start to realize benefits. And I think it's the same for digital, Stephen. I think there's a heavy emphasis on, and I'm very happy to be proven wrong on this. I think there's a heavy emphasis on technology for technology's sake. And once you've gone live with your new toy or your new piece of kit, it stops there. That's you're now digital. Well, of course, we all know that's not true, and that's the sense I get from the research of the sort of UK market over the last 12 months or so.
Thank you, David. There were a couple of rabbit holes that I was quite tempted to dive into in that last the last sentence or two, but perhaps a conversation for another time. Sure. I would agree with that sentiment. Genuinely, perhaps I'll just say that this from my own non-academic but experiential point of view, working with organizations, yes, there's an awful lot of tech for tech's sake. I think perhaps I would extend that as far as I see a lot of process and practice for process and practice sake.
Yes.
It never ceases to amaze me that you ask people, so why have you done that thing, whether it be the investment in a technology, an organizational change. Have you seen the results that you thought you might want to see? Are you traveling in the direction you want to go? And they shrug of shoulders, presumably until the next CIO turns up and says, what we've got to do is...
we must be digital, absolutely.
We've got to go in a different direction because that's what was wrong last time. I was just thinking, just as a kind of as a concluding thought, anyway, I'll add your some contacts on your LinkedIn link and so on into the end of this video if people want to kind of make contact with you. I'll add your the website to if organizations are seeking support in this space. Presumably they would be able to reach out to you and have a conversation. But I understand you're speaking at a couple of events soon too, so I can add details of those too if you like, and people may be able to come along and watch.
Yeah, please do, Steve. The thing which is of interest to me is the whole role, so the whole topic, the CIO role, certainly in this sort of new digital context, is certainly a hot topic at the moment. And I think we still have this open question about the future, or the long-term future of the CIO. I don't think that debate has subsided at all. In fact, it's getting more interesting from my point of view. But either way, we will need somebody at C-suite who understands this stuff. So yes, it's a great topic to be involved with at the moment. And yes, I'll be talking on this over the next coming months here in the UK.
Very good. Thank you, David. Really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm grateful for you being so open and engaging in the conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you, Stephen.